Hey everybody! So we're looking at Punnett Squares in this video, and Punnett Squares are a really simple table that we can draw, but they're a useful tool for predicting genotypes and phenotypes in genetics. So we're going back in history a little bit first to this guy here, who was called Gregor Mendel. So Mendel, it's a really famous name in genetics. You might have heard of it before. He was a monk back in the mid-1800s. And he obviously had a lot of time on his hands. He spent a lot of his time, hours and hours and hours and years, breeding pea plants. So like the peas we eat. He bred them, and he started realizing that there were patterns with the way that certain traits were inherited in these pea plants from generation to generation. And he actually did lots of maths, and he based his maths on lots and lots of data from breeding hundreds and hundreds of plants. And he actually came up with all the mathematical rules, and he wrote the laws of inheritance without even knowing anything about genes or DNA, because that wasn't discovered until the 20th century, 100 years later. So he discovered the laws of inheritance, and so that's why he's considered the father of genetics. And actually, his work wasn't even discovered until about 40 years after he died. So he died in about, or he did his main work in about the 1860s. People didn't discover his work or realize how significant it was until the 1900s, 20th century. And Punnett Squares was one of the main tools he used to do all his scientific discovery. Okay, so what we're going to do is learn Punnett Squares using the example of albinism here. So albinism is a genetic condition in humans. You can see here, this person has albinism and their skin can't produce the pigment melanin. And that's what gives humans our skin tone. So people with dark skin produce a lot more melanin. But even people who we say are white, they're still producing melanin in their skin. But people who are albino, they can't produce any melanin at all. So, in this case, we're looking at the character of albinism. Or really of melanin production, but we'll call it albinism, that's fine. The phenotypes you can have for this particular gene, you can either be albino or you can be normal skin tone. And scientists have discovered that albinism is actually a recessive phenotype. So when we're writing the genotype for albinism, we're going to use small a to represent the albinism allele, and big A is going to be the normal allele. So albinism is recessive. Okay, so the way we use Punnett Squares is that they're going to help us predict the percentages or the probabilities of children in terms of the albinism trait. So, we'll start off drawing a Punnett square. Let's choose a simple example firstly. So, we will have one person who is homozygous normal, and the other person is homozygous recessive. So that person's actually albino. So if these are the two parents, we can use a Punnett square to predict all the genotypes and the phenotypes that are possible in their children. So a Punnett square is really just a two-way table. So we start off with a noughts and crosses board, basically. On the side columns, we've got the parents' possible alleles that they can pass on to their children. So let's just say we've got the father is normal, the mother is albino. So the father, he's got 2 copies of the big A allele. So he can only ever pass on a big A allele into his offspring, because any gamete that he makes is going to have a big A allele in it. So at the top, we've got the father, and in the column on the side, we've got the mother. And we write the alleles, the possible alleles at the top. So he can either make a big A allele or another big A allele in his gametes. And for the mother, well, she can only ever have a small A allele in her gametes, in her egg cells. So she's going to have a small a or a small a. Okay, and then we combine the row and the column together, because this is representing a gamete. So they're the two father's gametes, and then these two are the mother's gametes. So if this father's gamete combines with this mother's gamete, then that child is going to have big A little a as their genotype. And then we could have this gamete of the father's combining with this one of the mother's, big A little a. And you can see again, this one and this one, big A little a. This one and this one, big A little a. So this is a really simple example. Actually, the only possible genotype that a child could have of these parents is big A little a. So what we do in a Punnett square at the bottom is we list the possible genotypes and the possible phenotypes. And we write it as a percentage or a fraction. So in this case, it's pretty easy. So the possible genotypes in this family, well, all the children have to be big A little a. So we just write 100% big A little a. What are the possible phenotypes in children of this couple? Well, if they're always big A little a, remember that albinism is recessive, so all these children are going to be heterozygous, so they're going to be normal. They'll have the normal phenotype. So 100% of the children are going to have the normal phenotype as well. Okay, so that's how we set up a Punnett square, and we predict the genotypes and the phenotypes of the children. That's a really simple example. Let's do a different situation with some different parents. Okay, so in this case, let's have the mother and the father. Let's say both of them are heterozygous. So she's got the big A little a genotype, so does he. So they're both normal, but we call them carriers because their phenotype's normal, but they're each carrying a copy of the recessive allele here. Okay, so we'll set up our Punnett square again. Got our two-way table. We'll put the mother here and the father here. It doesn't matter which side you put the mother and the father on, the top or the side. So now, the mother, she can produce a gamete that either has the big A allele, but she can also make gametes that have the small A allele in. And the same for the father. So now it matters which two gametes join together when the mother and the father have children. So if these two gametes happen to come together, well then that child's going to have big A, big A. If these two gametes come together, that child's going to be heterozygous. The same if these two come together. And if these two gametes happen to come together, that child is homozygous recessive. So they're going to have albinism. Okay, so let's work out the percentages now. So the possible genotypes. Well, we can see we've got 25% will be big A, so a quarter. Big A. 50% are going to be heterozygous, because there's two possible ways to make a heterozygous child out of 4. 50% heterozygous. And then there's another 25% homozygous recessive. Small a. Okay, that's only the genotypes though. The important thing is what are the phenotypes that are possible in the children. Because this is actually considering, are their children going to have albinism or not? So, remember, albinism is recessive, so this is the only child that's actually going to have albinism out of the 4. So remember, this is only probabilities. We're not saying if they have 4 children, 1 will be albino. It's still probabilities. So 25% are going to be albino, 75% are going to be normal. So we'll list the possible phenotypes and we'll say the probabilities of them too. 75% normal and 25% albino. So there is a way that 2 normal people can have an albino child if they're both carriers. Okay, so you can see here Punnett squares can be used for any combination of genotypes in the parents, and they'll help us to predict what possible genotypes and phenotypes their children are going to have.